What's up, sugar boogers? It's Patrick from LSAT Lab, and we are looking at analogy and application questions. What are we being tested on in Reading Comp? Sometimes they're testing us on a very local level, like, do you understand this sentence? Can you find this detail? Or what is implied by this sentence that we've pointed you to? Other times, they're testing us on our understanding of how 2 or 3 sentences work together. Is one sentence an example of the other? Does one of them provide context for a certain word or phrase? Is there a causal connection that we can infer? Other questions, such as how is this passage organized, what's the purpose of the paragraph, are testing our understanding of entire regions, like what's the main point of this region or how does it relate to other regions. And then we've got questions testing us holistically, like what was the big takeaway, why did the author write this, and some open-ended opinion questions also really just sound like a takeaway. Today we move into the realm of extraterrestrial questions. The answers come from beyond the passage. We're looking at new ideas and figuring out whether they match something in the passage or how they would impact the passage. Today we're going to look at analogy and application questions. Both of these are pretty rare. We're going to see one of each maybe on each test. Analogy will say the word analogous. Application will either ask you for an example of something or to consider some hypothetical. The common challenge with them is that these answer choices usually go into totally new realms, totally new topics or contexts. So the skill that we're practicing is stripping away that specific story and getting to the deeper general stuff. So let's practice stripping! We've got 2 volunteers. They seem a little bit reluctant, but they are game. And oh boy, they have misconstrued what I was asking them to do. Curtain please. Thank you. All right, this is from a passage that's about blackmail law. The answers have nothing to do with that. Ignore the specific story and figure out what's like the deeper generic thing that's going on. Pause the video until you have stripped all 5 answers. Each of these answers is going to give us 1/2 about North American law and 1/2 about Roman law. So A is talking about carpentry, which we don't care about, but it's saying over here, there's 2 things required, over here there's no requirement. So that would be the deeper essence we care about. 2 requirements versus no requirement. The yellow says it's illegal on trains, the blue says it's illegal on trains and buses. So we want to capture that there's an extra situation in blue where it's forbidden. C basically comes down to a lot of loopholes versus very few loopholes. For D, the left side is saying that it's illegal for this one specific group to do something, and then blue is saying it's illegal for anybody but this specific group to do something. In E, the yellow is saying it's illegal to do this thing, and the blue is saying it's legal, but there's definitely some strings attached, some extra penalties. There's been some variation. Sometimes the left is more strict, sometimes the right is more strict. In A and E, North American law is stricter, and in the middle 3, Roman law is stricter. Let's pause and read these passages so that we can find out which one is stricter. All right, now that you've read both of them, pause the video and see if you can find the correct answer. In North America, blackmail is a crime even though you are allowed to expose people's secret and you are allowed to charge them money for services. But when you combine them, it's illegal. In Rome, it wasn't a specific crime, it's just illegal to expose someone's secret unless you've got a good reason. D is the correct answer, and it's a really tough match. We would basically say that revealing someone's secret is forbidden for people who charge money for their silence. Whereas in Rome, exposing secrets is forbidden for everyone but the authorities. So owning a gun was exposing a secret, and felons were people charging money for their silence. And then the police and the military were essentially the public authorities having a legitimate interest. Only 42% of people are getting this right, and 100% of us are hating it. We can try to match it up by saying Canada and the US make it illegal for people charging money for their silence to expose someone's secret, but Rome didn't have a ban. Exposing a secret was illegal for everyone other than the public authorities. But that's really a sloppy, charitable way of matching it up. It reminds us that in Reading Comp, it's not always about a correct answer, it's just about best available. like my memoir. We want to have two different mentalities. On our first pass-through answers, there's a lot of fish in the sea, demand perfection, insist on your must-haves like you're dating in your 20s.
Too punk, too corporate, too short, too tall, too mayonnaise.
But the second pass is like dating in your 30s. You're going to tolerate imperfections and just look for the best available option.
Good at bass. He's got most of his hair. We both like necklaces. You can teach me computers. You can't have aioli without mayonnaise.
On our first pass, let's be picky. Let's demand satisfaction and look for an answer that we feel like is adequately supported. But when we don't find that, let's be flexible and go for best available. Here's another analogy question, but this one comes from a comparative passage, and it's asking us to look at these two different titles and pull out a relationship. So once again, we're going to pause the video and practice stripping all 5 answers down to their general essence. Each answer choice is going to give us a title that represents passage A and one that represents passage B. With A, we can see that there's some relationship in topic because card counting is part of blackjack, which is a form of gambling. And A's got a positive take, B has a negative take, the evils of gambling. So we sort of want this specific form of gambling is great versus gambling overall is bad. In B, it's a little bit easier because the topic is definitely the same, Mayor McConnell. And one is saying something negative, one is saying something positive. So we could just understand that as a relationship of this thing sucks versus this thing rules. With C, it's sort of like A, it's a strained relationship, pruning fruit versus cooks. It's both about food, but it's not even necessarily food preparation. The other overlap is that they're both for beginners. So it's sort of like a beginner's guide to X and a beginner's guide to Y, with X and Y both belonging to the category of food. With D, just like with B, they're once again talking about the exact same topic, the storm weather forecasting model, and one is emphasizing the bad, one is emphasizing the good. So again, we would get a relationship like this thing sucks, this thing rules. Looking at E, the two choices have in common building repair, but the first one is talking about the fundamentals of repair, and then the second one's talking about the repairs needed by this building. So the fundamentals of X versus the X-related problems with this thing. Alright, well since we've stripped them all down, let's just throw them into A through E rather than the actual answer choices. And now let's pause the video and read the actual passages. Welcome back. What is the relationship between these two passages? Well, they're both talking about transferring land, transferring property. They also both talk about the idea of whether or not you acquired property in accordance with principle or whether you fraudulently acquired it. So like a just versus unjust acquisition of land. And then they both talk about what should we do about unjust ownership of land? Should we rectify it? So one relationship these passages have is a lot of similar topics. But we also see that A is very broad. It's about the principles underlying this theory. Whereas B is very specific. It's about a 1790 congressional law. So let's head to the answers thinking, well, A is broad, B is specific, but they're on the same topic. A reverses which is specific, which is broad. It also has these opposite takes. One's a thumbs up, one's a thumbs down. And then C makes it seem like they're on different topics. Also, passage B did not feel like a beginner's guide to anything. B and D are the same answer, so they will just cancel each other out. And we didn't have this thing where one of them hated property justice and the other one liked it. So we're left with E. It does seem to have a little bit of a broad versus specific thing going. Can we make it work? A is definitely about the fundamentals of property justice. So we can match that up, but that means that X has to be like property justice. So is the other passage saying these are the property justice problems with this specific thing? Yeah, I mean, they're talking about the illicit ownership. That's a property justice related problem with Native American land claims. Okay, we can make E work. It's the correct answer. It's our best available.
If I hadn't settled for best available, I wouldn't be reaping these rewards.
Babe, we're all out of root beer.
I'll head to the store.
Oh, now I feel bad for her, but I would also like some root beer. I would also like some root beer. All right, let's try one more analogy question. Pause the video and practice again, stripping away the topic, getting down to the essence. Welcome back. The topic of A is word processors, so let's get rid of that. We've got logical opposites like non-essential versus important and packed with versus fewer. So we want something like too much minor stuff gets in the way of the big stuff, having less is better. For B, we're going to ignore economic models and notice that we're talking rational versus irrational, so those are logical opposites. And we're saying we presume rational, but studies show irrational. So we got to capture the idea that what we assume is at odds with data, and then the conclusion is, so bad predictions. C is saying that something's based on mistaken notions, so we should replace it. That kind of has a similar feel to the last one, that our beliefs are at odds with reality, and in this case, we should replace the method. D is saying that a certain thing is justified only in certain cases, and therefore, if you try to justify it in any other case, it'll be illegitimate. That kind of sounds like a self-justifying argument. Obviously, if there's only two where it's okay, then any other case would not be okay. E is making two claims about autonomous, and then it's talking about having control versus not having control, logical opposites. So we're saying that X doesn't imply Y. Here's an example where X is happening, but Y isn't happening. We stripped those 5 arguments. Let's pause the video and see what argument this passage is making. This analogy question is testing arguments, and the meaning of argument or reasoning is a conclusion supported by some evidence. What was the author's conclusion in this passage? Well, towards the end she says, this insight suggests that, and that's a conclusion indicator. This shows that, this demonstrates that, this reveals that. And then we also have that opinion indicator should. So, okay, the conclusion is we should get rid of retribution. We could actually look at the answer choices now and just see whether the conclusion in each answer choice feels like a possible match for we should get rid of this thing. There's usually a keyword in each answer that helps you find the conclusion. Let's see which of these best matches the idea of should abandon retribution. Having less stuff can be better sounds too weak. The theory will make bad predictions doesn't sound like abandon it. The method should be replaced does kind of sound like should be abandoned. Let's keep that. D says any other sort of case is not cool. It's kind of absolutist. It doesn't feel great, but maybe keep that. And then X doesn't imply Y. It doesn't sound at all like we should abandon this thing. So C and D are off to the lead based on their conclusion. What about their evidence? Well, what is the evidence? Why should we abandon retribution? This insight is why. So the previous sentence is telling us why. People think they're making free rational choices, but brain scans say, So let's compare that to the evidence half of C and D. Which one matches better with like, you think you're doing this, but in reality you're not? Looks like C. Our assumptions are at odds with reality. Whereas D is just saying, these are the only 2 cases where it's okay. That doesn't match at all. The original language of C was that because it's based on mistaken notions, it should be replaced. And that's pretty close to, because we're deluding ourselves, we should abandon this. Only 58% of people are getting this right. And in part, that's because there's several tempting trap answers that are baiting us with word similarity. So B used rational, just like the passage did. E talked about whether or not you have control, just as the passage did. And D used the word moral, just as the passage did. On parallel and analogy, the test writers try to fish us in with like superficial similarities like word bait or topic bait. But on analogy, we are looking for that deeper logical essence. It's not about the topic. We actually want to get rid of the specific nouns and just deal with the logical relationships like positive, negative, more, less. Sometimes it's easier to just look at an answer choice and say, hey, what kind of logical relationship are you offering? Did the passage have anything like that? And lastly, the correct answer might be a pretty poor fit. We've just got to accept the best available. If the store doesn't have IBC root beer, we got to come home with A&W. Moving on to application questions. One style asks us for examples of certain things, like give us an example of that trend we talked about, or something that would align with the theory that matches the definition or matches the style of the artist we talked about. Other application questions feed us hypotheticals and say, how would the author judge this? Or what would the passage say about this hypothetical? Take a sec to pause the video and read through these 5 question stems to get a feel for them. The example style is usually much easier, so let's start by looking at those.
As it says on my application, I'm a self-starter that embraces new challenges.
Which of the following best exemplifies that claim? When you got to lead your first team and you cowered under the desk? When you were asked to say grace at Thanksgiving and you pretended that you were asleep?
Or
when you proposed resorting to cannibalism before the ship had even sank?
by process of elimination, I'd have to say the best example that I'm a self-starter that embraces new challenges is when I galvanized my fellow survivors to resort to cannibalism, debatably too early.
Definitely too early.
Better to be early than late, right?
For work meetings, yes. For cannibalism, not so much.
Let's try a sample problem. You don't need the whole passage to answer it. The text on screen is enough, so pause and give it a try. Welcome back. They're asking us for an example of stealing thunder. So that keyword does show up several times in the first couple paragraphs, but in the first paragraph, it sounds like they're really defining it. And so the text we want to match up with is how they have defined this term. It's being defined as revealing something negative about your client before the other lawyer does. A says that we're warning jurors about a client on the opposing side, but this is supposed to be about our client. So A's got a mismatch, we can get rid of that. B says that we are disclosing information about our client. Is it negative information? Yeah, we're saying in the past they've been guilty of plagiarism. Are we revealing that before the opposing lawyer does? I guess so. It says we're doing it in opening statements, so we are doing it very early. Let's keep it. Once again, the specific details don't matter. It's those underlying logical relationships we care about. C says that we are talking about our client, having negative info, a minor criminal background. And are we revealing it before the opposing lawyer? Nope. We're responding to their revelation. They got to reveal it. How dare they keep their thunder? We should have stolen it. D is saying that we are pointing out during opening statements. Okay, so we are before the opposing lawyer. Negative info about our client? No, this is bad reasoning in the opposition's lawyer. That's not the same thing. With E, we're talking about our client, but we're not stressing any negative info before the opposing lawyer can. We're stressing that our client is believable and that the circumstances mean that we should be lenient on them. B is our correct answer. It has all the ingredients. We're revealing negative info about our client before the other lawyer can do so.
The prosecution will try to make it seem like my client knowingly conducted lottery fraud. They'll probably even bring up that time years ago when my client was a little too eager to resort to cannibalism.
Objection. She just stole my thunder. In my defense.
I am your defense.
All right, let's try another application question. Same style, the example style. Pause the video and give this a try. Welcome back. The question stem says we need an example of specific performance. Specific performance shows up a few times on screen, but the first instance sounds the most like they're defining it. This approach is called specific performance, so that feels like the text we should match. We're being told that it's when you have a breach of contract, and then the court says, sorry, you guys have to do what it says in the contract. All right, so in A, is there a breach of contract? Yeah, broke its contract. Is the court saying you got to do what the contract says? No, they just nullified the contract. Do we have a breach of contract? Yes, we refuse to work as contracted. Is the court saying y'all got to do what it says? Yeah, you have to do your contracted duties. The company has to pay the contracted salary. So let's keep that. In C, it is saying that there was a contract and someone failed to complete the project. Is the court saying, all right, well, you got to do what it said in the contract? No, the court is saying, hand the money over to somebody else. They'll finish the job. With D, there was a contract for someone to buy a piece of furniture, but the court is actually allowing them to back out of the contract and get their down payment back. In E, someone was contracted to work for a company, and they breached that contract. But the court doesn't order them to work for the company, it just says, all right, well then pay them for the inconvenience. B is the only one that checks both of our boxes. We want to figure out what text to match up with and sort of mentally create a couple checkboxes. What do I need to have? What are my must-haves? And then just ignore the story and seek out those must-haves. Okay, let's switch to the other type of application question, where they're pitching us hypotheticals. Pause the video and try this problem. This is the first paragraph of a passage, but it's all we need to answer this question. So the question stem wants to know when the Netherlands study would be least advantageous. So maybe the text told us something about, what would make the Netherlands study bad, but more likely, they told us when it would be advantageous. Like an umbrella is advantageous in the rain, and so then we flip that to go, all right, so it would be least advantageous if it was a sunny day. So we should go looking for why was the Netherlands study advantageous? What motivated it in the first place? We got details like the nutrients had been depleted, the land was heavily fertilized and thistles were dominating. It was impractical to just remove and replace the topsoil. And even though it would fix itself over time, that would take too long. So since those were the reasons for the Netherlands study, we could flip those to get a decent answer here. This study wouldn't be as helpful if the nutrients were not depleted. It wouldn't be as helpful if it weren't heavily fertilized, if thistles weren't kicking butt, or if replacing the topsoil was practical, or if allowing it to fix itself didn't bother us. So A is saying that the nutrients are depleted. Well, that's the opposite. We wanted nutrients are not depleted. B is saying that the topsoil can easily be removed and replaced, which sounds like it would be practical to replace the topsoil, so let's keep that. C says it's been heavily fertilized. We wanted not heavily fertilized, so that's another opposite answer. D starts talking about commercial grass plants like rye. That just feels totally outside the window of text we had. And then E is talking about corn, which also feels very outside the window of text we had. If we were to control F corn, we would see there is some mention, although it's still not in the support window we were reading. And if we were to control F for rye, we would see nothing but the tumbling tumbleweed. There's no rye in this passage. So B is our correct answer, and we call this style of correct answer flip the fact. If the passage has told us that since we can't just replace the topsoil, we need this Netherlands study, then the flipped idea is if you can replace the topsoil, you don't need the Netherlands study. It's more common for them to flip these two ingredients. Give us the hypothetical that what if the topsoil could be easily removed? And then the answer would say, well, then the study wouldn't be that useful. So they usually give you a hypothetical and then ask you what judgment makes sense. Here they asked you which hypothetical would line up with this judgment.
All right, let me give you some hypotheticals about working here to test your judgment.
Oh, good. I love tests.
Suppose you're making copies and there's a jam in the copier. What would you most likely do?
I would see if I can fix it on my own, and if not, then I would ask our IT specialist, and if she's not around, then resort to cannibalism.
He's got plan A, plan B, and plan C is for cannibalism. Let's pause the video and try this question. The keywords in the question stem show up in one sentence together. The hypothetical is what happens if we eliminate disease organisms? And so again, we want to think flip the fact. Well, what do disease organisms do when they're present? I'll flip that to get my answer. It says here that they've concluded that this is because of the disease organisms. So whatever it says in the previous sentence is what disease organisms do. The seeds on the enriched plots fared better than unenriched, but worse than nearby land. So are disease organisms making the enriched plots do better than unenriched, or making them do worse than nearby land? Well, we're told that in these fields that are constantly used for agriculture, they're overrun with disease organisms, but they're lacking in beneficial fungi. So this gradient where the unenriched doesn't do as well as the enriched doesn't do as well as the nearby land, is because the soil we're dealing with is overrun with disease and doesn't have a lot of helpful fungi. But when we put on a scoop of nearby dirt, then it's overrun with disease with a little bit of helpful fungi. And then the nearby land has been out of production for 20 years. It's not overrun with disease, and it's got tons of that fungi. All of that, I guess, is just teaching me the obvious, that like disease organisms are bad, beneficial fungi is good, and so if we eliminate the bad thing, we should be in a better situation. The seeds should fare better. And I guess we could also say there's less stuff for the fungi to fight. So what do they do when they're present? Well, they make the seeds fare worse. So what are they going to do if they're eliminated? The seeds will fare better. That would be our prediction. Let's head to the answers looking for something like that. A says that the helpful fungi would decline. So that's a turn for the worse. That's the opposite of what we're looking for. B says that the unwanted thistles wouldn't be able to survive. That definitely sounds like an improvement. It does sound a bit strong, so we might have to worry about that later. With C, the survival of beneficial plants would be more likely. The chance would increase, which is a mild positive. I'm liking that one. D is saying that all beneficial microorganisms would increase, so that's definitely a turn for the better, but it is also very strong. All types would increase. And then E is saying that the disease organisms would increase, so that's a turn for the worse. That's the opposite of what we want. And proportionally is also a very strong specific idea. Of the three remaining, we thought C was like the safest positive idea, but none of them seem to deal with seeds. If we reread the beginning of that paragraph, though, we see that seeds are really a proxy for native plants. So C is our correct answer. We call this pattern flip the causal difference maker. When you see this is because, the seeds fare worse because of the disease organisms. So then the test is rewarding us for thinking, all right, so if we didn't have the disease organisms, the seeds would do better.
Let's hear it one more time for our volunteers.
How'd the show go, boys?
They brought us here to do a presentation on Lyme disease. Oh, Terrence, look at their innocence. Do you remember your first analogy question?
I sure do. I picked D, but I should have gone with A.
All right, guys, let's do one last killer problem, level 5 analogy, before we wrap this up. You've got everything you need on screen. Pause the video and give it a try. The last paragraph, you may have noticed, does not talk about thistles. So what do they mean, the spread of thistles curtailed? They mean the native plants returning. This is sort of a term swap. It's the same as restoring the natural diversity. So what we say is that we're going to sow in beneficial microorganisms and then plant this wide variety of seeds. But they do ask us about the last paragraph. It's the second paragraph where we said plant a wide variety of seeds. It's the last paragraph where we talked about sowing in beneficial microorganisms. So the question's probably asking about that thing. How do we make sowing in beneficial microorganisms abstract? They were living on the plant roots and strengthening them against disease organisms. So if we think of this battle between thistles and native plants, in their corner are these microorganisms which are fighting against these disease organisms that would otherwise be attacking our native plants. It's quite a cast of characters. So in order for us to curtail the spread of thistles and help the native plants win, we're adding something that gives them a shield or a boost of protection against those diseases. Protection against something bad. Notice that all these answers start off the same way, that we're trying to prevent A from winning a majority. We're trying to prevent thistles from winning a majority in this plot of land. A says we're doing it by publishing editorials, so that would be adding the microorganisms, which encourage things that support thistles to start supporting something else. We don't have any match for that. There wasn't anything in the passage that was supporting thistles. B is saying that we are taking an action to defend against attacks, which does sound like a shield or a boost of protection. we would be saying that the rival party are native plants and that the broadcast journalists are disease organisms.
The enemy of the people.
So, I mean, we could potentially make this work. C is saying we're adding microorganisms to discourage supporters of thistles from voting. Well, again, just like A, what's supporting thistles? We weren't ever talking about anything like that. Similarly, D says that we are adding these microorganisms to attack the things that support thistles. We don't have anything in the passage that is supporting thistles. And then E is saying that we're trying to create antagonism within the thistle party. We're going to create a lot of troll accounts on Thistle Facebook, and we're going to pit the extremists against the centrists. All right, so B was our correct answer. As long as we found the idea that microorganisms were trying to defend the plant, then we would have a pretty good chance at this answer, but only 41% of people are finding that. Analogy is so hard that sometimes you just want to save it for last or never. But if we're doing it, we strip away the topic, focus on the verbs and relationships. You might reverse engineer the answer and then ask yourself, did the passage have that relationship? And just keep in mind it's best available. These are not perfect matches. Application has the example style, which is pretty easy. You just find what text you need to match, make some checkboxes, and look for those must-haves. The ones dealing with hypotheticals are often testing flip the fact thinking. So you figure out, what do I know about this topic? And then you flip it to get the correct answer. That'll do it for this lesson. Check out our other videos on YouTube or come visit us at lsatlab.com.